Good evening and welcome to this third edition of the third episode of the Construction Cashflow Show. And I'm really delighted to have a fantastic guest for you this evening. And her name is Lynn Mann, and she's a certified management accountant. She's been involved in accounts for 20 years, with a real interest in small business. And I'd like to, without further ado, to introduce you to Lynn. So good evening, Lynn.
Hello, Stuart, and thank you for having me tonight. It's great to speak to you.
You're most welcome. And Lynn, would you like to start by giving us just a little bit about your background and how you started your current business?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, my background is within accountancy, and it was one of those things I always wanted to be an accountant from a young age. That was until I went to start to study it and then realised in my mind it didn't make an impact. But I continued to work within business, so businesses from multinationals to startups to non-profits for over 20 years. And then I got the opportunity to change. My husband was his job was moving abroad, and so I retrained as a coach. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with coaching, and I went to work with a friend in her coaching business, which was focused on sustainability. And then she asked me to train her in the account. She said, if I'm going to grow this business, I need to understand what the numbers mean. So I pulled together a small training program and trained her to how to understand the accounts. And at the same time, I read a couple of articles around small business failure rates. And one of the things that was highlighted was the number of small businesses that fail because of their cash flow, and also from not having a plan. Now, these were things that didn't make sense to me because, yes, okay, people run out of money, but cash flow can be managed. And all of a sudden, I realized actually this is where I could have an impact, where I could make a difference in helping small business owners understand more about what their numbers are telling them. Now, bringing in here my coaching, what I also realized and what I knew was that the stories we've heard growing up and the beliefs we've formed can actually have a big impact on how we look at things and how we interact with money and with numbers. And so by bringing this together, I then decided to form my business, which is called Earth Aconta. There's a real play on words here. Aconta is the old French for the root of the word accounting. And so for me, it was around every business has to count, that they have to produce their accounts. But at the same time, every business matters. Now, the earth side comes in because actually every business on this earth matters and counts towards what happens on the planet. So that's how it all came around. And so now I work with small business owners to help them change how they're engaging with their business and with their business finances so they can make their business count.
That's really interesting, Lynn. And I know even with my business, you know, I started my business as a quantity surveyor and run it as a quantity surveyor. So as a technical profession, and we tend to, and I suppose it's probably similar for a lot of business owners, you tend to focus on your business in terms of what you do. And for me, it was service delivery. And really, I didn't know a huge amount about what the accounts were telling me and kind of left it to the accountant. And, you know, I think sometimes we can neglect that side of the business. And you're right. There's a kind of a mindset that we leave that to the accountant. So what you're doing is really, really interesting. And I know over the last few months, I've been starting to get more involved and more interested in my accounts. And I'm sure some of the listeners would be, particularly small business owners, would be really interested in the program that you've put together.
And I really agree with what you say there, because one of the things is that what I find is we go in, we're experts in our own field, and the focus does it, whether your background is coming out of corporate and going and starting your own business, or whether you're just starting your business as an expert in your field, it the accounts and the cash flow is just an aside. It's something that's not there, um, and and as you say, a lot of people will outsource it to a bookkeeper or an accountant and forget about it. And I had a really good example recently of the consequences of this. So interestingly, I actually had some building work done recently, and we interviewed the various builders beforehand to in the kind of the selection process. And actually, being an accountant, I also went back and checked, did some due diligence on their numbers. And what I found was actually two of the builders had gone bankrupt in the past year. And we sat down with one of them because the architect highly recommended him, and really grilled him as to see what had happened. And what he shared was exactly what you said. He'd given his numbers to his accountant, and his income was growing every year, but he was still making a loss, and the accountant was still signing off his accounts. So he didn't see any problem. He thought he could just outgrow the loss, that as his income grew, his costs would grow, or his profit would eventually kick in. And the problem was he wasn't looking at the numbers, he wasn't understanding what was driving it. And I guess he was juggling his cash, and eventually one issue on one job just pulled the rug, and he had to file for bankruptcy. Now, that really showed him the importance of understanding his numbers and really understanding his business. What he realized was his whole business model was wrong, and he was incurring a lot of overheads, and this was impacting his cash flow and his profitability. So just going back to what you said, I think it is that thing that small businesses generally are often or are not aware of the impact the information the numbers can share with them, and the impact it can have if you're not aware of what those numbers mean.
Exactly. And we in fact, it's a big problem, and you're quite right, in construction. And what I found is, even when, as quantity surveyors and clients procure contractors, generally what you did is absolutely excellent in terms of what you asked your contractor around his cash flow, because quite often quantity surveyors will go out to tender with a tender package, and they'll do the pre-qualification questionnaire and ask about the bank details, etc. But rarely do they sit down with a contractor and say, okay, how are you going to manage the cash flow on our project? How are you managing your operational cash flow on your other projects? And will you be having cash coming into the project that's timed correctly to pay the suppliers on my project? So these are questions that actually rarely come up. And considering the failure rate in construction of construction companies, it's astonishing, really, to be honest, that we're, as an industry, we're so bad individually at managing cash flow and understanding the numbers. And what we tend to do in construction, we feed the responsibility for cash flow right down the supply chain. So we're relying on lots and lots of individual businesses that make up a construction project to be managing their cash flow. And to me, that seems quite a high risk strategy.
Yeah, it is, because all it needs is for one person not to be or to be too tight, have too tight a margin, and for somebody to demand the repayment. And I think even with, I know, for example, when you look at companies, there's often, they're using, for example, money owed to the inland revenue that they've collected as a buffer. And actually, that is a false buffer. And really, to make sure that your company is almost safe and secure, it's about forming your own cash buffer, so that you have got that there to protect you should something collapse in the chain.
Mm. Absolutely. And do you think there is, in construction or even in small businesses, really, do you think people have a kind of mental block with the numbers, with even in their own businesses? I mean, even looking at a balance sheet, sometimes a balance sheet can tell you a lot of things about the health of a business, but
Yeah.
how many small business people actually know how to read a balance sheet?
Yeah. And I think there's a number of different things there. So one is actually is knowledge, which you highlight. Understanding how to read a balance sheet. Um, Once you know how to read a balance sheet and what it's telling you, then as you said, it can tell you a lot of information about your business. But actually, sometimes there's a fear about even looking at that because it's something you don't know. You don't know what it's supposed to tell you, what it means. And I'm not sure there's potentially enough training around that. But the other thing is actually is kind of going back to the stories and the beliefs that people have around money and also around numbers. Now, if I look at myself, for example, I'm an accountant, and people expect that accountants would have a good relationship with money. But for me, when I worked in business, it wasn't about money, it was about numbers. I was dealing with numbers that were telling a story. I didn't relate them to being money in the business. And the one job I really could not see how I could have done was a credit controller, because there you are chasing money. Now, if you think about it growing up, a lot of the stories we hear are about it's rude to talk about money, or you shouldn't be chasing money. And these stories actually influence how we deal with money. And so if we're brought up thinking that, then even things like chasing overdue debts, which is really important, but doing that we hold back on because we don't want to be seen as as creating conflict. We don't want to be seen as chasing money, and that can have, just something as simple as that can have an impact on your business. But at the same time, looking at numbers, if people have had a bad experience with numbers and maths during school, this can really impact how they engage with numbers. And it's amazing how many times I tell people what I do, and they just look at me and go, "Oh, numbers." And you can literally see the shutters coming down on their face, because they don't want to deal with numbers and they don't want to deal with money.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like what what you mentioned about numbers that tell a story, and I think you're right. There's, with money and chasing money, there is emotion attached to certain aspects of money and how we transact with money. And but what would you say to listeners in terms of how they can maybe change their view or mindset towards money in more in terms of, they're numbers that tell a story, something that might make us, even myself really, that to help us see numbers as telling a story, and numbers are nothing to be frightened of.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to really actually understand how you do currently engage with money or with numbers, and understand that perspective. So one of the exercises I actually get people to do is to imagine that they're an animal. So if you were an animal in relationship, so how do you relate to money in terms of an animal? So some people, for example, might say, well, they're an ostrich. They really just stick their head in the sand. I've had other people actually say they were moles and burying in the ground, going away from it. I had somebody share that she was a snow leopard, and for her it was really interesting in trying to unpick what that meant. But in looking at, actually, so if you relate yourself to as an animal, how you relate to money. What are the characteristics of that animal? So what does that mean? And that can help you understand what it is that you've got to deal with. Once you know where the fear is coming from, or where the beliefs are coming from, then you can start to look at it and say, well, actually, is that true? Because a lot of the beliefs we hold are not true. And it's only when we start to question them and look for evidence to find a contrary belief that our brain can start to say, oh, actually, that belief isn't true, and I can see that there possibly is an alternative here. And then we can start to remove that fear. Because you're right, if we look at our numbers and we're coming from a place of fear, then what we're going to see immediately is the negative, and we're going to close down. Whereas if we can come from that place of curiosity, that place of actually, what are these numbers telling me? What can I learn from them? How can they help me? Then we can start to see what's possible, and we can start to see the story that they're actually telling us. And I think as an accountant, this was one of the things that I guess helped me, was I wasn't emotionally attached to the numbers. So I could see the story, and it was a case of getting the elements, tweezing the elements of the story out from the people I was working with, because they had the background. And that's one of the things with the business owner. You know what's going on in your business, you know what's happened, and it's learning how those actions connect and translate into your numbers. So as you were talking before about kind of what's driving cash, but even, and you were talking about the chain and how things flow through, but it's understanding how everything fits together. So going from your sales and understanding how that flows through to cash. So even from what's the first action that you take, is it networking, and understanding how everything flows through, then you can start to see, well, actually, are my numbers reflecting the actions and activities that have happened within my business in the past month?
That's very interesting, and sometimes we all, as business owners as well, we tend to spend our time on minutiae throughout the day, checking emails, doing this and doing that, and we're not focusing on maybe the key things that we should do, and that's understanding what's happening, what the stories emerging in our business with the numbers.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, I think, that it's kind of learning to be able to zoom in, because we do have to focus on the detail, but then zoom out to be able to look at that bigger picture, and understand actually what's telling us. But really, one of the other things that can really help us is actually starting to measure key activities. So if we can identify what are those key things that are happening within our business, it may be that, going back to sales. So one of my clients had been doing some work on social media, and she was went back and looked to see where her income was coming from and where her clients had come from, and realized they all came from networking and from people she knew. It was word of mouth. And so she realized that actually that's where she needed to spend her time. And therefore, by starting to measure, in her case there, starting to measure, say how many networking events she went to, how many people she was following up with, that kind of information helps her to understand, is that flowing through into the business? And I think at times people forget that the numbers that are showing up on the P&L account, on the balance sheet, on the cash flow, they are coming from those original activities. So by measuring those original activities and understanding the impact they have on your business, you can then really start to understand how the story comes together. It's almost like if you were telling, if it was a book, each area of your business is like a different chapter, and then the
Yeah,
final chapter that pulls it all together
yeah,
is the numbers in your accounts.
yeah, definitely. And I think you're right. And it's something I've been looking at recently with my business, that, you know, the cash flow in the business is around, okay, so how many leads do I need to get into my sales funnel in order for me to get a number of X number of clients out at the bottom of my funnel, in terms of those that are interested in my and purchasing my products and services. And that reflects, again, as you say, on to the balance sheet, onto the profit and loss account. And so it's a whole story, isn't it? From the,
Yeah,
you know, my marketing, my sales, my branding. Am I building trust? Do people know me? Am I putting
yeah,
my products out there? People getting to know me? And all of that feeds ultimately into the numbers, don't they?
yes,
Um,
totally.
and in fact, I'm trialing a product at the moment, and it's called Transfer. And what that does, it follows the cash throughout the supply chain, and it tells a story. And there's a dashboard on this particular software. And what happens is that the contractor and the suppliers, they issue a promise down the line. Rather, instead of payments, they issue a promise. Once the work's done, they issue the promise down the line once they get the invoice, and the money then flows from the developer or the lender direct to source, so to the suppliers, and then comes back up the line. And on the dashboard, I can see the money flow, so I can
Right.
kind of start to see a story emerging about the project and the site. I can see almost the health of the project and the story grow. Even without going to site, I can see how the money's flowing on the dashboard from one party to another. Is it flowing when it should have flowed? You know, is there a little bit of congestion here or there? It's almost like the you know, the blood flowing through veins, if you like.
Yeah,
It finds its way through the shortest path, and it tells a story. So, you know, you're absolutely right. It's really interesting how we look at the story of the numbers. And I was really interested about your analogies with the animals, and I think there's a lot of us that are probably identify with the ostrich,
yeah,
bury our heads in the sand, particularly when things are not going so well.
yeah.
And you know, so what would you, I mean, you mentioned about a course that you did with your friend earlier and that you've been developing. I mean, where could some of our listeners find more about how to look at their numbers differently, or maybe contact you or get in touch with you regarding any courses
Yeah.
and that kind of
And
thing, if they
uh,
want to take it forward?
so I post regularly on LinkedIn. So if people just want to kind of have a look and see, learn a bit more about what I do, then if you can check me out on LinkedIn. Um, Also, I've got my website's earthaconta.com, or you can email me at Lynn, which is LYN, at earthaconta.com. And I'm happy to answer any questions at all. So yes, please feel free to reach out and ask any questions.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, thank you for that, Lynn. And I'm sure we all got a lot out of it. I know I did. And in fact, I think we can all do with, you know, re-looking at our numbers, understanding our numbers and looking them and getting into the right mind frame and the mindset, and
Yeah,
understanding that there is a big picture, and our businesses there is a story around our businesses that can be told in numbers from start to finish, from sales to end of delivery through client experience, all end up being represented by numbers, don't they?
they
And
do. They really
yeah,
do.
so yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure I'm gonna, you know, I'm following you on LinkedIn, Lynn, and I find your post really interesting, so I'll continue to do that. And by all means, to the listeners listening today, get in touch with Lynn. There's a huge amount of knowledge she's got, and she can certainly get you into the right place and around the numbers for your business. So thanks very much, Lynn, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Thank you, Stuart, and thanks for the conversation. I've appreciated it.
Oh, you're welcome. So this is the Construction Cashflow Show, and this was Stuart Davidson speaking to Lynn Mann, and we look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. Well, thanks very much. Goodbye.